What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world was suddenly threatened by shadows you never saw coming? What if, in a single heartbeat, your entire reality shifted from luxury to the desperate, jagged edge of survival? The wind howls through the narrow alleyway, carrying the scent of damp concrete and metallic fear. CEO Jack, usually composed behind the polished glass of his high-rise office, now stands paralyzed. Beside him, Tu Tien, her violet coat a splash of defiance against the grime of the city's underbelly, clutches her chest. Their world has just been shattered. They aren't in a boardroom anymore. They are trapped in a corner, surrounded by two figures who have nothing left to lose, a couple, desperate and driven by a hunger that burns brighter than morality. The bag of money, their life's liquid capital, lies discarded on the filthy ground, a symbol of their sudden, terrifying vulnerability. But just as the man in the red shirt raises his hand to strike, a calm, steady shadow steps out from the periphery. Uncle Dung. His crisp white shirt is a blinding contrast to the gloom of the alley. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. He simply steps forward, his eyes fixed on the couple. The air in the alley grows deathly still. Who is this man, and why does he carry the weight of authority so effortlessly? And more importantly, as the couple drops to their knees in a sudden, frantic display of repentance, what does this reveal about the true cost of the life Jack and Tu Tien thought they had under control? The morning had started with the illusion of perfection. Jack had been meticulous, as always, his glasses perched perfectly on the bridge of his nose, his white shirt pressed to a knife edge. Tu Tien had walked beside him, her violet coat elegant, her smile genuine. They were navigating the city, feeling the rhythm of their success, but the city has a way of swallowing the arrogant. They had taken a wrong turn, a shortcut through the district where the city hides its failures. It was meant to be a quiet walk, a moment of respite from the endless demands of the CEO's life. Then, the ambush. It wasn't a sophisticated heist. It was primal. The couple, one in red, one in blue, emerged from the gaps between the crates like ghosts. They were gaunt, their eyes hollowed out by days without sleep and nights without shelter. They didn't want a conversation. They wanted the bag. Jack's first instinct was to negotiate. He was a man of words, of contracts, of calculated risks, but the man in the red shirt didn't care about business. He shoved Jack, the force of it surprising the younger man, sending him stumbling back against the cold, damp brick wall. Tu Tien gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed off the alley walls. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening as she saw the desperation in their attackers' faces. "Give it to us," the woman in the blue rags shrieked, her voice cracking. Her hands were shaking, not with malice, but with a terrifying, raw need. Jack gripped the handle of the bag, his knuckles turning white. It wasn't just money, it was the payroll for his firm's expansion, the lifeblood of dozens of families who depended on his decisions. To give it up was to fail. To fight was to risk Tu Tien's safety. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. Just as Jack prepared to step forward, to play the hero despite the fear coursing through his veins, a figure appeared at the mouth of the alley. It was Uncle Dung. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has seen everything the world has to offer and found very little worth getting excited about. His white shirt was as pristine as if he had just stepped out of a luxury laundry service, despite the dust of the road. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he simply stopped, his presence acting as a physical weight in the center of the confrontation. The couple froze. The man in the red shirt, who had been ready to lunge at Jack, suddenly went limp. The defiance drained out of his posture, replaced by a sudden, jarring wave of shame. Uncle Dung stood on the left side of the scene, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at Jack or Tu Tien. He kept his gaze locked on the couple. He slowly raised his hand, his finger pointing downward toward the bag of money lying in the mud. It was a gesture of command, ancient and absolute. "Is this who you have become?" Uncle Dung's voice was low, resonant, and echoed with a quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. The woman in the blue rags began to weep. It wasn't a performance. It was the sound of a spirit completely broken. She collapsed to her knees, her forehead touching the grimy floor. Her husband followed suit, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The bag, which moments ago had been a prize worth fighting for, now looked like a burden they couldn't bear to look at. Jack and Tu Tien stood on the right, still reeling. Their hands were still trembling, their hearts still drumming a frantic rhythm against their ribs. They watched, stunned, as the predatory tension that had held them hostage evaporated, replaced by a strange, somber atmosphere of penance. Jack looked at his wife. Tu Tien leaned into him, her hand gripping his sleeve so tightly it would surely leave a mark. They had been seconds away from a catastrophe, yet here they were, witnessing a scene of profound human fragility. Uncle Dung didn't move to collect the money. He didn't demand an apology. He simply looked at the couple, his eyes tracing the hollows of their cheeks, the fraying of their clothes. "Hunger is not an excuse for losing your soul," Uncle Dung said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it held the clarity of a bell in a storm. The man in the red shirt looked up. His face was a mask of misery. "We have nothing, sir. We haven't eaten in 3 days. We saw the suit, the confidence. We thought it wouldn't matter to you. But we didn't want to hurt anyone." "You did hurt them," Uncle Dung replied, gesturing toward Jack and Tu Tien. "You hurt the peace they had. You forced them into a corner where they had to fear for their lives. That is a theft you cannot pay back with an apology." Jack stepped forward, his confusion beginning to give way to a cautious, protective resolve. He looked at the money, then back at the couple. The CEO in him wanted to call the police, to follow the protocol that defined his professional life. But the man in him, the man who had just seen his wife terrified, felt a complicated stirring of empathy. "Why did you stop?" Jack asked, his voice steadying, directed at Uncle Dung. Uncle Dung finally turned his head, looking at Jack with eyes that seemed to see right through the expensive suit and the professional veneer. "I was passing by. I saw 2 people who had forgotten how to stand tall, and 2 people who had forgotten how to look at the world without being afraid. It is a sad day when we turn into animals, Jack." Tu Tien stepped forward, her violet coat swaying slightly. She looked at the woman in the blue rags. The woman's eyes were bloodshot, her hair matted, but beneath the grime was a face that looked hauntingly like someone who had once had dreams of her own. Tu Tien reached into her pocket, pulling out a small handkerchief, and then, after a moment's hesitation, she knelt down. The alley went silent. The sound of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the siren somewhere miles away faded into nothing. "What were you planning to do next?" Tu Tien asked softly. The woman didn't look up. "Disappear. Move to the next town. Try to find work that doesn't involve this." "You chose a bad path," Tu Tien said, her voice lacking the bite of judgment, but filled with the weight of truth. Jack watched his wife, a sudden pride swelling in his chest. He had been ready to escalate, to defend, to punish. Tu Tien was choosing to understand. It was a perspective he had been losing in the relentless climb of his career. He walked over and stood beside his wife. He looked at the couple on their knees, their heads bowed low. The initial anger that had fueled his adrenaline was fading, replaced by a sobering realization of how quickly the structure of his life could be dismantled. He had been an untouchable CEO, yet in the span of 5 minutes, he had been nothing more than a victim. "Get up," Jack said. His voice wasn't a command anymore. It was a decision. The couple looked up, startled. The man in the red shirt wiped his face with a filthy sleeve, his eyes darting between Jack and Uncle Dung. "Take the money," Jack continued, pointing to the bag. Tu Tien gasped, her hand moving to catch Jack's arm, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Not all of it," Jack clarified, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "But enough to get you food, and enough to get you to the next town. Enough to start something that isn't this." The man in the red shirt stared at him, his mouth agape. "Why?" "We tried to take everything from you." "Because I realized something," Jack said, his eyes shifting to Uncle Dung, who was watching him with a flicker of approval. "I realized that if I had succeeded in crushing you, I would have been no better than the fear you brought into this alley. I'm a CEO, yes, but I'm also a man who believes that mistakes shouldn't be the end of the story." Uncle Dung nodded slowly, his posture relaxing as he stepped back, leaving the space open for the others. The couple stood up, their legs shaky. The man reached for the bag with trembling fingers. He took only a portion of the cash, leaving the rest on the ground. He looked at Jack, then at Tu Tien, and finally at Uncle Dung. The gratitude in his eyes was almost painful to witness. It was a raw, unvarnished emotion that transcended the social divide between them. "We won't forget this," the woman whispered. "Don't thank me," Jack said, his voice firm. "Do something with it. The next time you find yourself in an alley, make sure you're the one walking out of it, not hiding in it." The couple turned and walked away, their steps hesitant at first, then growing more deliberate as they moved toward the sunlight at the end of the narrow passage. They didn't look back. Jack and Tu Tien stood in the quiet of the alley, the silence now feeling less like a threat and more like a heavy, meditative weight. The money was still there, a scattered pile of bills that had nearly cost them everything. Tu Tien turned to Uncle Dung. "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you know they would listen?" Uncle Dung smiled, a deep, weary smile that etched lines into his face. "People are rarely as lost as they look, Tu Tien. Sometimes they just need someone to hold up a mirror. They needed to see what they were doing, and they needed to see that there was a way to stop." He turned to Jack. "You did well today. Most men in your position would have let their pride dictate the outcome. You chose to protect your humanity instead." Jack looked at his own hands, still slightly shaking. He realized that the suit, the glasses, the title, none of it was as real as the pulse in his wrist, or the warmth of Tu Tien's hand in his. The CEO had been challenged by a homeless man in a red shirt, and in the process, the man had learned more about his own value than he had in years of corporate maneuvering. The three of them stood there for a long time, the shadows shifting across the brickwork as the day wore on. It was a turning point, the kind of moment that divides a life into before and after. They eventually walked out of the alley together. The city was still loud, still busy, still uncaring. But as they emerged into the bright, harsh glare of the main street, Jack felt a shift. He reached out and adjusted his glasses, then took a deep breath of the city air. It smelled of exhaust and dust, but it also smelled like a new beginning. Tu Tien walked beside him, her violet coat catching the wind. She didn't say a word, but her grip on his hand was firm, grounding. They didn't talk about the money they had given away, or the risk they had taken. They didn't need to. The lesson was etched into the day itself. Uncle Dung stayed behind for a moment, watching them walk away. He adjusted his white shirt, a tiny, satisfied nod, signaling the end of his intervention. He had done his part. The rest was up to the ones who had been given a second chance. As Jack and Tu Tien rounded the corner, leaving the alley far behind, they weren't just a CEO and his wife anymore. They were two people who had looked into the heart of darkness and found the light of a decision. They had seen the fragility of life and chosen to hold it with care. The story of the alley would stay with them, a quiet, haunting reminder of how thin the line is between the life we claim to own and the chaos that can claim us. But it would also be a source of strength whenever the boardroom felt too cold or the pressure of success became too heavy. They would remember the man in the red shirt kneeling in the mud and the man in the white shirt who had taught them the meaning of dignity. The city continued to spin, indifferent to their small drama. But for Jack and Tu Tien, the world had changed. They had walked in as strangers to their own vulnerabilities, and they were walking out as masters of their own compassion. In the weeks that followed, the office remained the same. The glass was still polished, the deadlines were still looming, and the demands of the firm were still relentless. But Jack had changed the way he navigated the corridors of power. He started to look at his employees, at the janitors, at the people in the elevators, not as tools or obstacles, but as stories waiting to be heard. Tu Tien, too, found a new purpose. She didn't need to change her wardrobe or her status to find meaning. She turned her attention to the foundations, the ones that helped those who had lost their footing, the ones who were standing in the shadows of the city's alleyways, waiting for someone to hold up a mirror. They never saw the couple in the red and blue shirts again. They didn't need to. The impact of that day was not in the follow-up, but in the ripple effect of their own choices. They had proven that even in the most cynical of worlds, a moment of grace can change the trajectory of lives. It was a bittersweet realization. They knew they couldn't save everyone. They knew that for every couple in an alley, there were hundreds more struggling in silence. But they also knew that they had made a choice that day, and that choice had saved something far more valuable than the money in that bag. It had saved their perspective on what it meant to be truly human. The city moved on, as it always does. The alley was eventually paved over, and the memory of the incident began to fade into the background noise of their busy lives. But deep down, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, Jack and Tu Tien carried the weight of that day. It was their secret, their silent anchor. And whenever they saw a white shirt or a flash of red in a crowd, they would be reminded of the man who stood in the gloom and showed them the path back to themselves. It was a reminder that no matter how high they climbed or how successful they became, they were always one wrong turn away from the reality of the street. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of all, to never be too far from the ground, to never be too high to see those who were kneeling, and to always, always remember the cost of a soul. The journey home that evening was quiet. They drove through the familiar streets, the lights of the city blurring into a tapestry of color outside the window. Jack drove slowly, his eyes scanning the sidewalk, not looking for threats, but looking for humanity. He realized then that the city wasn't a monster to be conquered. It was a community to be understood. Tu Tien looked out the window, her reflection in the glass soft and thoughtful. She reached out and placed her hand over Jack's on the steering wheel. It was a simple, grounding touch. No words were needed. They were a team, now more than ever, bonded by a shared secret and a shared sense of purpose. The house they returned to was elegant, filled with the trappings of a life well lived. But as they walked through the front door, the silence of the space felt different. It wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the silence of peace. They had lived through the chaos, and they had come out the other side. Jack took off his jacket and hung it up. He looked in the mirror, adjusting his glasses one last time. The man looking back wasn't the same CEO who had left that morning. He was someone who knew the value of a choice, the power of a quiet word, and the importance of looking at the world with eyes that were truly open. He turned to see Tu Tien standing in the doorway, her violet coat discarded, her expression one of quiet contentment. She smiled, and in that smile, he saw everything he needed to know about the future. They had their challenges ahead, their struggles, their moments of doubt, but they had the strength of their own integrity to guide them. The story of the alley was finished, but the story of their lives was just beginning to take on a deeper, more resonant meaning. It wasn't about the money, or the heist, or the fear. It was about the moment they stood in the mud and chose to be better than the circumstances they were trapped in. It was about the humanity they had salvaged and the dignity they had restored. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. The city continued its frantic pace, the lights continued to blink, and the lives of millions continued to intertwine in a complex dance of success and failure. But for Jack and Tu Tien, the path forward was clear. They would walk it together, step by steady step, keeping their eyes on the road and their hearts open to the unexpected truths that lay hidden in the shadows. They had learned that the most profound dramas aren't played out on the stages of the world, but in the quiet, desperate, and beautiful moments of connection between one person and another. They had learned that power isn't in what you hold, but in what you are willing to give. As they settled into the quiet of their home, the echoes of the alley still lingering in the back of their minds, they knew they had found something far more precious than the money they had lost. They had found each other in a way they never had before. They had found the strength to stand tall, the grace to forgive, and the wisdom to know that no matter what, they would always have the courage to face whatever the city threw at them. The night was deep and still, the stars hidden by the glow of the urban sprawl. But inside, there was a light that would not be dimmed,